Elena Chen stood at the entrance of the Galactic Academy's main hall, her heart pounding against her ribs like a drummer keeping time to the three suns rising over the crystalline spires. The building itself seemed to pulse with energy, its quantum glass walls shifting through impossible geometries that would have given Escher a migraine. All around her, beings from across the galaxy flowed through the entrance, some floating, some crawling, some moving in ways that made her eyes hurt if she looked too long. Just another day at Space Harvard, she muttered to herself, adjusting the translator pin on her collar. The device hummed softly, converting the cacophony of alien languages into something her human brain could process. The sounds of clicks, whistles, and electromagnetic pulses transformed into words, creating a symphony of academic discussion that would make any Earth university sound like a quiet library. The Galactic Academy wasn't just prestigious, it was the prestigious institution of higher learning in the known universe. Getting accepted was about as likely as winning the lottery, while being struck by lightning, while your atoms spontaneously rearranged themselves into a perfect cup of Earl Grey tea. Elena was only the third human ever admitted, and the first to major in advanced theoretical mathematics. Speaking of which, she was going to be late for her first class if she didn't hurry. Elena navigated through the crowded halls, dodging a group of Arcturian students whose tentacles took up far too much personal space, and slipped into lecture hall Theta 9 just as the chronometer chimed the start of the session. Professor Zyx'tal was already there, his four eyes scanning the room with the kind of disdain that took years of academic superiority to perfect. His crystalline exoskeleton caught the light from the holographic displays, sending rainbow refractions dancing across the walls. The Centaurian professor was renowned across 17 star systems for his work in quantum probability matrices. He was also, as Elena would soon discover, renowned for being an absolute quantum-grade jerk. "Ah," he said, all four eyes focusing on Elena as she tried to find a seat. "Our new, human student has decided to grace us with her presence." His translator rendered his clicks and whistles into perfect Oxford English, complete with condescending tone. "I trust you've reviewed the prerequisite materials? The basic universal constants, the fundamental laws of 11-dimensional space-time." Elena nodded, taking a seat between a being that appeared to be made entirely of living gas and something that looked like a sentient library card catalog. "Yes, Professor. I've completed all the required reading." Remarkable, Zyx'tal clicked, his crystalline fingers tapping against his lectern. "And you understood it all? With your limited neural architecture?" A ripple of amusement passed through the class. The gaseous being next to Elena actually condensed slightly in what she assumed was their version of a suppressed laugh. "I believe so," Professor Elena replied, keeping her voice steady. "Though I admit, some of the concepts regarding quantum entanglement across parallel probability streams took a second read." Only a second read. How efficient the sarcasm in his voice could have corroded titanium. "Well then, perhaps you'd like to explain to the class why the Ig-Draschi conjecture fails in non-Euclidean space when applied to recursive time loops." Elena took a deep breath. She'd actually spent 3 weeks studying this exact topic, anticipating something like this might happen. The Ig-Draschi conjecture assumes a linear progression of causality even in recursive scenarios. However, when mapped onto non-Euclidean space, the causality chains form what we on Earth would call a Mobius strip of logic. The error compounds exponentially at each iteration until the entire mathematical model collapses. The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a cork drop. Professor Zyx'tal's external crystalline layer flickered briefly, the Centaurian equivalent of blinking in surprise. Technically correct, he admitted, though it sounded like the words physically pained him. Though I'm sure it was mere pattern recognition rather than true understanding. The rest of the class passed in a blur of complex equations and subtle jabs at humanity's primitive understanding of mathematics. Elena took detailed notes, her tablet filling with diagrams and formulas that would have made most human mathematicians weep. Later that night, in her dormitory pod designed for silicon-based life forms but modified for her carbon-based needs, Elena reviewed her notes. The holographic displays surrounded her like a cocoon of pure mathematics, equations floating in the air like confused fireflies. "You think humans are simple, Professor," she whispered to herself, pulling up her private research files. "Wait until you see what I've been working on." On her main display, a complex series of equations began to take shape, a mathematical framework that combined Earth's primitive approach with advanced alien principles. It was beautiful, elegant, and completely revolutionary. And someday soon, she was going to prove that humanity deserved its place among the stars. But first, she had homework to do. Elena cracked her knuckles and dove back into her studies, the 3 moons of New Cambridge casting their light through her window as equations danced around her head like dreams made manifest. 2 weeks into the semester, Professor Zyx'tal made his move. The lecture hall's holographic displays burst into life, filling the space with a dazzling array of mathematical symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. "Today," he announced, his crystalline form gleaming with barely contained satisfaction, "we address the horizon paradox." The professor's 4 eyes swept across the room, lingering just a fraction too long on Elena. "A problem that has confounded our greatest minds for 3 centuries. The gaseous being next to Elena, who she'd learned was named Mist of Dawn, breaking condensed into an excited droplet. Even the typically stoic library catalog creature rustled its knowledge cards in anticipation. The display shifted, showing a complex series of interlocking algorithms that seemed to fold in on themselves like an origami puzzle designed by a madman. "The challenge is simple," Zyx'tal continued, though his tone suggested it was anything but. "Solve the paradox. Show us why our most sophisticated quantum computers fail when attempting to process these calculations. The student who succeeds will not only pass this course, but will receive immediate recognition from the Galactic Mathematical Society." Elena's eyes widened. The GMS was the most prestigious mathematical organization in known space. Even being mentioned in their journals was considered a career-defining achievement. Of course, Zyx'tal added, mandibles clicking in what might have been a smirk, "We must be inclusive. Our human student is welcome to attempt a solution, though perhaps she'd prefer to work on something more suited to her species' capabilities. Basic algebra, perhaps." Scattered laughter rippled through the room. A Vulpexian student in the back actually barked with amusement, their fox-like features twisted in mirth. But Elena wasn't listening to the laughter. Her attention was locked on the shifting equations before her. There was something about them, something tantalizingly familiar. "You have until the end of the semester," Zyx'tal declared. "Begin." The room erupted into activity. Students of various species began frantically copying down the equations, some using multiple appendages to capture different angles simultaneously. Elena remained still, her eyes tracking the patterns as they danced through space. Wait. Dance. That was it. She pulled up her personal tablet, fingers flying across the haptic interface. The patterns in the equations, they weren't just mathematical constructs. They moved like something she'd seen before, something distinctly Earth-like. "Excuse me." Professor Elena raised her hand, her voice cutting through the busy silence. "These algorithms, they're meant to model energy transfer across dimensional boundaries, correct?" Zyx'tal's external layer flickered in surprise. "That is, correct. And the paradox occurs because the energy seems to disappear at random intervals, creating what appears to be a violation of universal conservation laws." Now all 4 of the professor's eyes were focused intently on her. "Continue." Elena stood, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "The problem isn't with the math. It's with the perspective." She gestured to the hovering equations. "We're trying to track the energy as if it moves in straight lines, but it doesn't. It moves like water." "Water," the Vulpexian student snorted. "The primitive human thinks of drinking fluids at a time like this." But Elena ignored the jibe, her mind racing ahead. "On Earth, we have something called fluid dynamics. Water doesn't just flow, it eddies, it whirls, it creates patterns called turbulence. These equations, they're showing the same behavior, just across dimensional boundaries instead of physical space." She began manipulating the holographic display, her fingers drawing new patterns in the air. "If we apply the Navier-Stokes equations modified for 11-dimensional space, of course, and combine them with von Karman's vortex street theory." The equations began to shift, reorganizing themselves like a puzzle finding its true form. Several students gasped. Even mist of dawn breaking began to vibrate at a frequency associated with extreme excitement. "Impossible," Zyx'tal whispered, but his voice lacked its usual certainty. "Not impossible," Elena replied, still working. "Just unexpected. We've been looking at it like a linear problem, but it's not linear at all. It's a flow state, a continuous movement of energy that follows patterns we discovered studying something as simple as water moving past rocks in a stream." She input one final calculation, and the entire mathematical structure transformed. Where before there had been chaos, now there was harmony, a beautiful, intricate dance of numbers and symbols that made perfect sense. "The energy doesn't disappear," Elena explained, her voice growing more confident. "It forms vortices in dimensional space, temporary holding patterns that our sensors weren't designed to detect. We couldn't see the solution because we were looking for something complex, when really it was simple all along." Zyx'tal finished, his crystalline form vibrating with what might have been shock, anger, or possibly respect. The room had fallen completely silent. Even the usually chatty quantum AI that managed the classroom's environmental controls seemed to be paying attention. "Of course," Elena added, unable to resist, "this is just a primitive human's perspective on the matter. I'm sure there are many other approaches we could consider, perhaps involving more advanced concepts." Professor Zyx'tal's external layer flickered rapidly through several colors before settling back to its usual hue. "Class dismissed," he announced abruptly. "Except you, Ms. Chen. We have much to discuss." As the other students filed out, some shooting her looks of amazement, others of disbelief, Elena gathered her things calmly. Inside, though, she was dancing. She'd seen the pattern, recognized it from countless hours spent watching waves break on the beaches of Earth, from studying the way wind moved through clouds, from observing the simple, beautiful mathematics that governed her homeworld's natural phenomena. Sometimes, she realized, the most advanced solutions came from the most basic observations, and sometimes being primitive meant seeing things that others had become too sophisticated to notice. Now she just had to survive whatever conversation Professor Zyx'tal had in mind. But somehow she suspected the dynamics of that interaction had shifted, much like the equations that still danced in the air around them. The memory hit Elena as she stared at her latest calculations, floating in the holographic space of her dorm room at 3 a.m. Earth Standard Time. She was 12 again, sitting in her grandfather's workshop in San Francisco. Rain drummed against the windows as he showed her his prized possession, an antique mechanical clock. "Look closely, Elena," he said, opening the back to reveal the intricate gears. "Mathematics isn't just numbers on a page. It's the poetry of the universe. These gears, they dance together in perfect harmony, just like the planets, just like the atoms in your cells." Present-day Elena smiled, watching her current equations spin and whirl. Her grandfather had been right. The universe was all about patterns and rhythms, cycles within cycles. That's what the aliens had missed in their pursuit of pure mathematical perfection, the simple beauty of mechanical interaction. A gentle chime at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Enter," she called out. K-Car Thax lumbered in, his crystalline exoskeleton glowing softly in the dim light. Unlike Professor Zyx'tal's sharp, angular form, K.R. Thax's crystal patterns were more organic, almost flowing. He'd been the first friendly face she'd met at the academy, literally running into her on orientation day when his gravitational stabilizer malfunctioned. Still awake, Elena, his translator, rendered his clicks and whistles into a warm baritone. "The suns will rise soon." Just finalizing my presentation for tomorrow, she gestured at the swirling equations. "Want to see something cool?" K.R. Thax moved closer, his crystalline form resonating with curiosity. Elena manipulated the holographic display, pulling up a simulation she'd been working on. "Watch this. It's based on something from Earth called a double pendulum." The simulation sprang to life, showing a simple mechanical device that created incredibly complex patterns, chaotic but predictable, just like the dimensional energy flows we're studying. "Fascinating," K.R. Thax hummed, his crystal structure shifting colors in appreciation. "Your species sees patterns where we see only chaos. Perhaps that's why you're here." Another memory surfaced Elena at 16, watching the first alien ship land on Earth. The whole world held its breath as humanity joined the galactic community. She'd known then, standing in that crowd with her grandfather, that she would find a way to the stars. "Do you think you're ready for tomorrow?" K.R. Thax asked, interrupting her reverie. "The entire faculty will be there. The Galactic Mathematical Society is sending representatives." Elena's stomach did a little flip. "Thanks for reminding me," she said dryly, "because I totally wasn't nervous enough already." "You'll succeed," K.R. Thax said with complete conviction. "You see things differently. That's your strength, not your weakness." Elena thought about her grandfather's workshop again, about the way he taught her to see mathematics in everything, in the swing of pendulums, in the flow of water, in the dance of planets around stars. She thought about all the nights she'd spent studying both human and alien mathematical principles, building bridges between two very different ways of thinking. "Tomorrow," she said, making one final adjustment to her presentation, "I'm not just presenting a solution, I'm showing them a new way to look at the universe." K.R. Thax's crystals chimed softly, his species' version of laughter. "Now you sound like a true mathematician. Just try to get some sleep. Humans need that, right?" Elena laughed. "Sleep is for people who aren't about to revolutionize transdimensional mathematics." But after K.R. Thax left, she did try to rest, lying in her modified sleep pod, as the first of the system's 3 suns began to peek over the horizon. Tomorrow would change everything. Either she'd prove that humanity deserved its place among the stars, or she'd become another example of human inadequacy. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. "The universe speaks in mathematics, Elena. All we have to do is learn to listen." She was listening. And tomorrow she would make sure the universe heard humanity's voice in return. The grand lecture hall hummed with anticipation. Beings from across the galaxy packed the crystalline amphitheater, their varied forms creating a living tapestry of intelligent life. In the front row, representatives from the Galactic Mathematical Society sat with their neural recorders active, ready to document what Professor Zyx'tal had promised would be either a breakthrough or a spectacular failure. Elena stood at the center of it all, her heart thundering in her chest. The holographic projectors surrounding her waited silently for her input. In the audience, K.R. Thax's crystals pulsed encouragingly, while Professor Zyx'tal's smug expression suggested he expected nothing less than complete humiliation. "Begin, Ms. Chen," Zyx'tal announced, his translator barely containing his condescension. "Show us your primitive solution." Elena's hands trembled as she activated the first display. The familiar equations of the horizon paradox sprang to life around her, dancing in the air like cosmic fireflies. A murmur rippled through the audience. They'd all seen these equations before, had all failed to solve them. "Distinguished colleagues," she began, her voice cracking slightly. She paused, took a deep breath, and thought of her grandfather's workshop. When she continued, her voice was steady. "We've been approaching this problem from the wrong direction. We've tried to force the universe to follow our mathematical rules, when we should have been letting mathematics follow the universe's rules." She gestured, and the equations began to move, flowing like water in a stream. "On Earth, we have something called the butterfly effect, the idea that a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil can cause a tornado in Texas. It's chaos theory, but it's predictable chaos." Professor Zyx'tal's external layer flickered with what might have been amusement. "And this relates to trans-dimensional energy transfer. How, exactly?" Elena smiled. This was her moment. Like this. Her fingers danced through the holographic interface, and suddenly the equations transformed. They began moving in familiar patterns, the double pendulum from her research, the flow of water around rocks, the dance of planets around stars. The mathematical symbols twisted and turned, following paths that seemed chaotic but contained an underlying order. "The energy doesn't vanish," she explained, her confidence growing with each word. "It follows natural patterns, just like water in a stream. When water hits a rock, it doesn't stop existing. It forms eddies, vortices, patterns we can predict and calculate." The audience leaned forward as one, even the gaseous beings condensing in concentration. Elena's hands flew faster, adding layer upon layer to her demonstration. "Look at these patterns," she continued, highlighting specific mathematical sequences. They're the same patterns we see in Earth's weather systems, in the way blood flows through veins, in the spirals of galaxies. The universe doesn't care about our artificial divisions between mathematics and physics, it just flows. She pulled up a new set of equations, one she'd derived from her grandfather's clock. Even something as simple as this mechanical clock demonstrates the principle. Each gear turns another, creating a harmony of motion that keeps perfect time. The dimensional boundaries in the horizon paradox work the same way. They're not barriers, they're gears in a universal machine. The holographic display erupted into a dazzling showcase of interconnected systems, each flowing into the next in perfect mathematical harmony. The room fell silent as her solution unfolded before them, beautiful in its elegance and devastating in its simplicity. A Volpexian mathematician in the front row stood abruptly, their fur bristling with excitement. The calculations. They're perfect. The energy patterns maintain conservation across all dimensional boundaries. Impossible, Professor Zyx'tal whispered, but his crystalline form had lost its smug opacity, becoming almost transparent with shock. Elena kept going, her confidence now unshakable. By applying Earth's fluid dynamics equations and chaos theory to trans-dimensional space, we can predict exactly how energy will flow across dimensional boundaries. The paradox isn't a paradox at all, it's just nature doing what nature does best, finding the most efficient path. She input one final sequence, and the entire mathematical model crystallized into a single, breathtaking equation. It was beautiful in its simplicity, profound in its implications, and undeniably correct. The room erupted. Mathematicians of all species began talking at once, their translators creating a cacophony of excited scientific discussion. The GMS representatives were frantically recording every detail, their neural networks practically glowing with activity. Professor Zyx'tal stood motionless, all four eyes fixed on the floating equation. His crystalline structure had taken on a strange, almost admiring hue. You, he said finally, used primitive Earth concepts to solve one of the greatest mathematical challenges in galactic history. Elena shook her head. No, Professor. I used universal concepts that humanity happened to notice by watching butterflies and playing with clocks. The mathematics was always there, we just had to learn to see it. The applause that followed wasn't just for her solution. It was for every human who had ever looked at the world and seen the mathematics in its beauty. It was for her grandfather and his clock, for every river that had ever taught humanity about flow, for every pendulum that had demonstrated chaos and order were two sides of the same coin. As the acclaim washed over her, Elena caught K-Car Thax's eye in the audience. His crystals were pulsing with pure joy, and she could have sworn she saw Professor Zyx'tal's external layer shift to a color she'd never seen before. The Centaurian equivalent of a respectful smile. The excitement in the grand lecture hall showed no signs of diminishing. If anything, it grew as the implications of Elena's solution began to sink in. Species that communicated through light patterns were practically strobing with enthusiasm, while the gaseous beings had formed themselves into complex mathematical symbols in tribute. Professor Zyx'tal stepped forward, his crystalline form catching the light in ways that reflected his internal conflict. The hall gradually fell silent. Everyone knew what came next. Tradition demanded that he, as the challenging professor, formally evaluate the solution. Ms. Chen, he began, his translator struggling to convey the complex harmonics in his voice. In 3 centuries of teaching at this institution, I have never, he paused, his external layer rippling with emotion. I have never been more pleased to be proven wrong. A collective gasp swept through the audience. No one had ever heard Professor Zyx'tal admit to being wrong about anything. Your solution is not merely correct, he continued. It is beautiful. You have shown us that true understanding comes not from complexity, but from seeing the fundamental patterns that connect all things. His 4 eyes blinked in sequence. Perhaps we have been too quick to dismiss what we considered primitive perspectives. Elena stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. Thank you, Professor. But I didn't succeed because I'm human, or because Earth mathematics is better. I succeeded because I was willing to look for answers everywhere in your advanced theories and in my grandfather's old clock, in quantum mechanics, and in the flow of rivers. She gestured at the equations still floating above them. This solution isn't human or alien, it's universal. And maybe that's the most important lesson here, that every species, every culture, every perspective has something valuable to contribute to our understanding of the cosmos. The GMS representatives were practically vibrating with approval. One of them floated forward, a being of pure energy contained within a protective field. "We would be honored if you would present your findings at the next Galactic Mathematical Congress," it pulsed. "Perhaps it's time we all learned to see the universe through new eyes." K.R. Thax's crystals chimed with joy from the audience, and even the Vulpexian students who had once mocked her were nodding in appreciation. After all, Elena concluded, smiling at her former tormentor-turned-colleague, "Isn't that why we reach for the stars? Not to prove we're better than anyone else, but to share in the wonder of discovery." Professor Zyx'tal's crystalline form had shifted to a deep, respectful blue. "Indeed, Miss Chen, indeed," he turned to address the hall. "Class dismissed, though I suspect our real education is just beginning." As the audience began to disperse, still buzzing with excitement, Elena thought about that old clock in her grandfather's workshop, its gears turning in perfect harmony. Like the universe itself, it had been teaching her all along. She just had to learn to listen. And now, finally, the galaxy was ready to listen too.